The subcommittee will come to order. And good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for being here. On July 9, 2011, the Republic of South Sudan became the world's newest nation. In a referendum held in January of that year, nearly 99% of the population voted to become independent from the Republic of the Sudan. Although there were those who felt the South Sudanese were not prepared for independence, the people of that country believed otherwise and rejoiced in severing their ties to the regime in Khartoum after many years of war and efforts to undermine the South. Unfortunately, the people's rejoicing was short-lived. The lack of infrastructure and transparent governance frustrated any hope of progress for this fledgling nation. Despite significant arable land, agricultural production did not increase, largely due to a lack of transportation and power infrastructure needed, which also prevented significant mining or manufacturing operations. Nearly 5 years after independence, South Sudan remains heavily dependent on its oil production, which represents as much as 98% of its revenue. As the price of oil has fallen worldwide, South Sudan became the producer earning the least from each barrel of oil, estimated between $9 and $12 a barrel. Although an increase in agricultural would have helped bridge the gap, the displacement of so many farmers, the continuing insecurity, and the recent spread of violence to the agricultural heartland prevents any benefits agriculture could have provided. Consequently, South Sudan is projected to have a negative growth rate this year of nearly 8%. More than 2.4 million people have been displaced by the conflict just since December of 2013. 706,600 of them are now refugees in neighboring Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya. United Nations officials estimate that more than 6 million people need humanitarian aid, and in nearly a quarter of the country's population, or 2.8 million, facing life-threatening hunger. Bob Levitt, Assistant Administrator for USAID, will testify today that half of all Sudanese, 6.1 million people, are in need of humanitarian assistance or protection this year. And over half of all children aged 6 to 15, 1.8 million children, are not in school in South Sudan, the highest of any proportion in any country, close quote. Pardon me. Efforts to address the needs of the South Sudanese people have been blocked by various fighting forces. At least 52 relief workers have been killed since the civil war began. And according to the United Nations, there are numerous reports of harassment, threats, and active hostility towards aid workers. Apparently, targeted attacks to prevent aid from reaching certain communities have meant that far too many people in need of help cannot be helped, even in UN compounds, which have also come under attack. Greg Simpson and I were scheduled to visit South Sudan on a trip that unfortunately coincided with the eruption of the violence in December of 2013, so that trip was canceled at the request of the State Department. But for more than 20 months since, fighting between forces led by Salva Kiir and former Vice President Riek Machar continued without stoppage despite several ceasefire agreements. In fact, the targeting of populations and oil facilities became worse the closer the signing of a final agreement came, as both sides competed for territory before agreeing to halt hostilities. Unspeakable human rights violations have occurred, as documented by the African Union Commission of Inquiry on South Sudan, and UN reports have corroborated that. The interethnic violence, Dinka-Nuer conflict has now devolved into intra-ethnic animosity involving clans within larger ethnic groups. Marcel Wells of the Center for Civilian and Conflict includes a very touching and sad, tragic interview with Rebecca, a 29-year-old victim who lost her husband. She says, in part, the government soldiers came in and were looking for Nuers. They killed all they could find. When the armed opposition attacked, they killed the Dinkas and other tribes. Our dead relatives will never come back, but we need to know those responsible. Then we can decide to forgive them or send them to prison. I want to know why they killed innocent civilians. Why did they kill our children, she says. The government must recognize our suffering and rebuild our homes. Once our homes are rebuilt, our children are back in school, we have medicine, and the guns have stopped banging in my head, I will have what I need. We should be honest that both President Salva Kiir and returning Vice President Machar don't control all the forces still in the field. The merging of militias into the National Army has produced units more loyal to their commanders than to the government. Meanwhile, Machar's hastily assembled rebellion also lacks strict chain of command. Therefore, achieving a lasting end to the fighting will take more than a peace accord, although hopeful that has been signed by these two men. The United States has played a major role in ending South Sudan's long and destructive war with Sudan and was instrumental in its independence. Since then, the U.S. government has been the leading donor, contributing approximately $1.5 billion in humanitarian aid. Today's hearing will examine the role of the United States, the role that it has played and continues to play in search of peace, stability, and prosperity. And I want to thank our very distinguished witnesses for the role they have personally played in that effort. The State Department will describe the successes and failures, hopefully, in the nearly 5-year effort. Witnesses on both panels will explain how the optimism of 2011 devolved to the barbarism we are trying to overcome today. Let me just say to all my colleagues that we look forward to their testimony. I'd like to now yield to Elliot Engel, the ranking member of the full Foreign Affairs Committee, for any opening comments he might have.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Smith. As the ranking member of the full committee, I want to once again thank you for calling this hearing and thank you for the good work that you do. Ambassador Booth, Mr. Levitt, thank you for your service and for your testimony today. The two of you know as well as anyone the dire situation facing South Sudan. Since the war broke out more than 2 years ago, both parties on both sides, have committed gross violations of human rights and humanitarian law. Approximately 16,000 child soldiers have been recruited, mostly by the rebel forces. Ethnically targeted rape has been prevalent on both sides. And in February, government forces were involved in an attack on the UN protection of civilians camp at Malakal. At least 30 internally displaced persons lost their lives in this attack. More than 120 were injured, and about 1/3 of the camp was burned to the ground. The humanitarian picture in South Sudan is truly catastrophic. Nearly 3 million people are facing starvation, yet only 17% of the funding needed to respond to this crisis has been provided. Amid these bleak reports, I was glad to hear that this morning the United States announced more than $86 million in additional humanitarian assistance to help conflict-affected people in South Sudan. What makes this a crime and really a pity is that we had such high hope when South Sudan was formed and thought that that would be the beginning of a new era in the area. Instead, unfortunately, things have gotten worse. Yet even those trying to provide relief face danger. At least 52 aid workers have been killed since the onset of violence in December 2013, and many others have been harassed, threatened, and in some cases savagely beaten. Humanitarian convoys are subject to extortion at multiple illegal checkpoints throughout the country, multiplying the cost of the humanitarian response the people of South Sudan desperately need. On top of everything, I have deep misgivings about the peace deal meant to put an end to this violence. The peace agreement signed in August is a bargain negotiated by the political elites who created this conflict in the first place. I fear that it essentially resets the political landscape to what it was at the outset of the conflict and has little to do with the millions of people who have been affected. So we need to ask ourselves, what can we do to support reconciliation at the local and national levels to help prevent new flare-ups of violence? This is especially important in light of the government's decision to press ahead with the division of the country's 10 states into 28 states, a move that has created localized conflicts in parts of the country that had been relatively peaceful. Moreover, I worry that warring parties are simply paying lip service to issues of justice, reconciliation, and accountability, thereby ensuring that the cycle of impunity will continue. Contrary to the intent of the peace agreement, the man-made conflict in South Sudan is expanding, and the country's people, of course, deserve better. We know there aren't a lot of good options, but in my view, we should go forward with an arms embargo. For months, the United States has considered such a measure to ensure compliance with the peace process. However, the return of opposition leader Riek Machar to Juba yesterday, implementation of such a plan has lagged behind schedule. All the while, a supply of arms and ammunition to both sides has prolonged and escalated the conflict. I'm glad Mr. Machar has returned and consider this an important but modest step forward. Much more needs to be done, and I am concerned that more weapons entering South Sudan will only keep the parties from making further progress. We shouldn't think of an arms embargo as a point of leverage, but as a means by which to prevent further suffering. The UN panel of experts on South Sudan has endorsed this approach, and ambassadors from Angola, Senegal, Spain, France, New Zealand, and the UK, all members of the Security Council, have indicated support. So this is clearly far from a solution, but I think it puts us on the right side of history and could help move this situation in the right direction. I look forward to our witnesses and see what they have to say about what they think can be done. And again, I want to applaud our chairman for shining a light on this difficult challenge. I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes. I have a long-standing appointment with one of the ambassadors, but I will be reading the transcript of the hearing, and we'll keep in touch with Mr. Smith and work together with him as we have for many, many years. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses as well.
I want to thank Ranking Member Engel for his excellent statement, for his leadership, and for passage of his important bill yesterday on the floor. Congratulations on that. I'd like to now yield to Congressman Donovan, Mr. Donovan from Staten Island.
Mr. Chairman, I yield my time so we have more time to hear from the witnesses, but I appreciate your all. Thank you, sir.
Okay. I'd like to yield to Mr. Sicily.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and I also want to acknowledge the leadership of Ranking Member Bass, and thank you for calling this hearing on South Sudan's prospect for peace. And thank you to our witnesses. I look forward to hearing from both of you on the situation in South Sudan. Like most observers, I was optimistic when, after almost 40 years of war between Sudan and the South Sudanese, which claimed more than 2.5 million lives and displaced more than 4.5 million people, South Sudan emerged in 2011 as the world's newest country. However, the civil war that has ravaged the country since 2013 has had a devastating impact. Today, South Sudan faces another post-conflict reconciliation process, massive and chronic humanitarian needs, high-level corruption, and widespread displacement of its population. This conflict has displaced more than 2.3 million South Sudanese since December 2013, and the UN estimates that over 6.1 million people need humanitarian aid and 2.8 million people face life-threatening hunger. The human rights situation is horrific, with assertions from the UN and from UN officials that targeted attacks against civilians and UN personnel may constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity. The UN mission in the Republic of South Sudan reports that gross violations of human rights and serious violations of humanitarian law have occurred on a massive scale, with civilians often targeted along ethnic lines. And UNICEF estimates that the warring sides have recruited as many as 16,000 child soldiers, and that conflict-related sexual violence against civilians is prevalent. There are many serious challenges that remain as South Sudan moves towards implementing its peace agreement. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the prospect for peace and what the United States and the international community can do to improve prospects for peace in the country and begin to tackle the enormous humanitarian needs of the South Sudanese people. And with that, I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sicilian. I'd like to yield to Mr. Brumi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to say I was fortunate enough to be able to address Secretary Kerry when he testified before our Appropriations Subcommittee, and I asked him if he was, if the U.S. was willing to hold war criminals in South Sudan accountable by imposing additional targeted sanctions and an arms embargo to show that we were actually serious about the peace agreement and that violating its terms would not be tolerated. And I felt like the U.S. was about to get serious when he responded very assertively that the international community is about absolutely to prepare to put into place individual sanctions for a range of things that may have been committed in the course of the war. But since then, unfortunately, not one additional person has been subjected to sanctions or an asset freeze by the UN or by the U.S. Russia continues to block U.S. and U.K. motions at the U.S. Security Council, as you know, for an arms embargo with seemingly no pushback from the administration. Also, the February attack on a protected civilian site was without question facilitated by the government soldiers and aligned forces. This was a deliberate attack on a UN base, sanctioned by the government of South Sudan, with its soldiers killing over 30 and injuring over 100, deliberately and systematically burning down sections of a camp occupied by ethnic groups aligned with the opposition. Government forces turned to ash civilians, 3,700 shelters along with clinics, water tankers, nutrition centers, schools, etc. I hope that you address some of these issues in your testimony here today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to make a statement. I yield back.
First, I just want to appreciate the opportunity to sit with you and to listen. I've been involved with the Sudan issue for a while. Welcome Ambassador Booth and Mr. Levitt. They do great work. And with that, I'm going to yield back and listen to the...
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming and for your long-standing leadership on Sudan. I'd like to now welcome our two very distinguished representatives from the UN, from the administration, who are themselves leaders when it comes to Sudan. Ambassador Donald Booth was appointed U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan and South Sudan on August 28th, 2013. He previously served as ambassador to Ethiopia, Zambia, and Liberia. Prior to that, he was director of the Office of Technical and Specialized Agencies at the Department of State's Bureau of International Organization Affairs. Ambassador Booth has also served as director of the Office of West African Affairs, deputy director of the Office of Southern African Affairs, economic consular in Athens, and division chief for bilateral trade affairs at the Department of State. Without objection, your full, very distinguished record, and that of Bob Levitt will be made a part of the record. We'll then hear from Bob Levitt, who serves as Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID's Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. Mr. Levitt has over 20 years' experience managing humanitarian and development assistance programs and national security policies. From 2012 until joining the Bureau in September of 2014, he served as USAID's Executive Secretary and Senior Advisor for National Security Affairs. While on detail from USAID, Mr. Levitt served as the Director of African Affairs at the National Security Council at the White House from 2009 to 2012. He joined USAID in 2001 as a conflict resolution specialist in the Bureau for Africa after he worked for Catholic Relief Services from 1994 to 2000. Ambassador Booth, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before you today. Yesterday, April 26th, former Vice President Riek Machar returned to Juba and was sworn in as the first Vice President by President Salva Kiir. Now, this represents a significant step toward formation of the transitional government of national unity that both leaders had committed to when they signed the peace agreement 8 months ago. We expect the transitional government to be formed and constituted within days now. However, this will not, in and of itself, deliver peace and restore national unity. To achieve those outcomes, South Sudan's leaders will need to work together for the people of South Sudan. I'd like to note that progress this week came only after bouts of obstructionism by both sides. The progress of the last few days would not have happened without the intensive personal diplomacy of Ambassador Fee and her team in Juba, as well as Ambassador Hasluck and her team in Addis Ababa. They worked tirelessly to overcome the many last-minute hurdles that delayed Vice President Machar's return. Looking forward, the parties in the transitional government will have to demonstrate that they can and will work together to make tough decisions, to break old habits, and accept a new and intrusive degree of international financial oversight in order to convince the world of their seriousness in leading South Sudan to a better future. The United States is ready to help the transitional government do right by its people, but we need to see that this government will not repeat past mistakes. The United States will press for full implementation of the peace agreement, particularly the reform agenda contained therein. And there I'm referring to, first, economic reform. South Sudan needs to undertake rigorous macroeconomic reforms. It cannot spend when it doesn't have. It's time for austerity as well as revised spending priorities. We are coordinating with other international donors to ensure that any financial commitments in support of the transitional government will be conditioned on its acceptance of international oversight of its revenues and expenditures. Specifically, we believe that an external expenditure oversight mechanism needs to be established. To be seen as a credible partner, the transitional government also needs to demonstrate its commitment to allowing full and unfettered humanitarian access to all parts of the country. For too long, South Sudan has been the victim of some corrupt leaders in their mismanagement of its economy and natural resources. This cannot continue. To that end, my office and others in the administration are pursuing measures to identify and act against those responsible for wanton corruption and theft. We want to see a transitional government in which corruption is no longer the scourge that it has been in the past. And we will not neglect the possibility of trying to recover stolen money. Second, security sector reform. For more than a generation, South Sudanese society has been dominated by armed groups and by the perception that conflict brings rewards. It is imperative that men under arms be able to transition to peaceful and productive citizens. This disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration effort will require significant resources and enormous creativity to have a chance of success. South Sudan, however, must emerge from the transitional period as a state with an army and not an army running a state. And third, reconciliation and accountability. We fully support the peace agreement's provision for the hybrid court for South Sudan to be established by the African Union, as well as the establishment of a commission for truth, reconciliation, and healing. We are pleased to see that the African Union has begun initial preparations to create the court, and we are prepared to support it. Ethnic grievance fueled this most recent war, and to prevent another, the crimes of the conflict must be addressed consistent with both South Sudanese values as well as international norms. It's easy to name the way that this agreement might fail, and it's easy to find cause for pessimism still. We were appalled by the violence at the UN Protection of Civilians site in Malakal in February, in which men in SPLA uniforms opened fire on civilians. We are dismayed by the death toll of humanitarian aid workers, and we continue to be concerned about the government's 28 states plan, which has complicated implementation of the peace agreement and stoked grievances among communities. We have made clear to both sides that this kind of behavior has to end. I want to be clear that if any of South Sudan's leaders continue to work against implementation of the agreement, we are prepared to employ any measure, to include sanctions and an arms embargo, which we believe could change their behavior. I believe we must remain, however, committed to helping South Sudan work toward the laudable goals contained in the peace agreement. It really is more than just an accommodation between warring factions. It has important reform elements. The people of South Sudan, the people we've spent $1.6 billion in humanitarian assistance to support since the conflict began, are the reason we cannot throw up our hands in frustration. They are the reason we must be prepared to support the transitional government if and when it begins demonstrating its commitment to implementing the agreement. Any other course of action would simply abandon those South Sudanese to a future of more conflict and deprivation. These are the same South Sudanese who, with our support for their right of self-determination, voted for independence in 2011, and who deserve a country that lives up to the promise of its beginnings. Finally, I want to thank the members of the subcommittee for your ongoing attention to South Sudan and its people, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak before you today. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Booth, and thank you for your personal efforts that have been extraordinary. Mr. Levitt.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. Today, I would like to highlight the humanitarian crisis in South Sudan and how USAID has adapted its response to the situation. We join the Special Envoy in calling on the Transitional Government of National Unity to begin to address the country's urgent challenges. South Sudan's economy is in crisis, its people struggle to find enough to eat, and human rights abuses continue with impunity. The recent exodus of South Sudanese into Darfur, Sudan, shows the desperation that many face. A total of 2.5 million South Sudanese have fled their homes. Approximately 1 in 4 South Sudanese are experiencing extreme, life-threatening hunger. This year will likely be the most food insecure since South Sudan gained its independence. The U.S. government and our partners continue to do everything possible to help the people of South Sudan, providing nearly $1.6 billion in humanitarian assistance since December 2013. This includes more than $86 million we announced earlier today. Every month, we reach 1.3 million South Sudanese with life-saving food assistance, protection, clean water, and sanitation. We have moved over 344,000 metric tons of food assistance, which is enough to fill the equivalent of 18,000 tractor trailers back to back between here and New York City. Our partners also provide trauma and protection support to children and survivors of gender-based violence. I want to express our deep appreciation for our partners and colleagues on the ground for their courage and their commitment to save the lives of the South Sudanese. They continue to face significant security challenges and access challenges. Warring parties and armed actors have killed 52 aid workers, a dozen more since we testified last in December 2015. The parties are obligated under the peace agreement to allow humanitarian aid to flow without interference. Yet aid workers continue to deal with lengthy negotiations, numerous checkpoints, and other obstacles. I would like to thank Ambassador Booth and Ambassador Fee in Juba for repeatedly intervening to secure humanitarian access when it counts most. USAID has shifted its long-term assistance from helping to build the institutions of the new South Sudanese state to investing directly in the South Sudanese people. We educate children where they are now, including in protection of civilian sites at UN compounds across South Sudan. We have enrolled nearly 148,000 children, more than triple the number of students in the Washington, D.C. public school system. Despite these efforts, over half of all children aged 6 to 15 are not in school in South Sudan, the highest proportion in any country. We collaborate with other donors to support basic health care, including maternal and child health services and immunizations. We are helping the South Sudanese regain their ability to make a living. We recently announced a new effort to help communities in food insecure states to recover assets such as farming tools and seeds, and improving their nutrition. These investments will help reduce their dependency on emergency assistance. As Ambassador Booth highlighted, paving a way for transitional justice processes will be critical for South Sudan's future. USAID has piloted a program that helps communities overcome trauma that perpetuates historic grievances. We're also working with the South Sudan Council of Churches to engage the South Sudanese in grassroots healing and reconciliation. And we launched a peace center to educate citizens about the peace agreement. We all want to see South Sudan move forward. The transitional government of national unity must set the country on a path to peace and development. We expect the transitional government to prevent the extortion and physical threats of aid workers and to allow full freedom of movement for all civilians. We expect them to prioritize their country's health and other development needs. As part of our mission to end extreme poverty and promote democratic, resilient societies, we will continue to invest in the people of South Sudan and their efforts to build a more prosperous, peaceful future. I want to thank Congress and this committee for your commitment to the South Sudanese people. Your support makes our life-saving work possible. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Levitt. To begin the questioning, just a few opening questions. First, Ambassador Booth, you talked about any measure being on the table. You might want to elaborate a little bit. Of course, this is a time of some heightened hope, but we know that hope coupled with the credible threat of a downside, a sanction, personal especially, can sharpen the mind. The impact on food security, or food insecurity, more appropriately termed, on vulnerable persons, since it is very hard to get food aid as well as medicines to targeted populations, what impact do we know, Mr. Levitt, you might want to speak to this, is having on the elderly, children, particularly pregnant women? We know the great game changer of the first 1,000 days from conception to the second birthday. Is any of that happening now in Sudan? Are we about to see a period of stunting and other kinds of consequences, maladies that could be prevented? 15,000 child soldiers, is that accurate? Is it more or less? What's being done to reintegrate those kids? John Pendergast says that one factor not addressed, and he goes on to talk about the main driver being unchecked greed. He talks about looting frenzy, violent kleptocracy, looting and killing with impunity. But he suggests that the one factor that has not been addressed is this issue of unchecked greed. Your response to that? And Matt Wells, in his comments, points out that in February, Senegal, Angola, UK, and France supported an arms embargo and suggests that U.S. leadership has been lacking on an arms embargo. If the U.S. were to strongly support an arms embargo, it's likely that the position would prevail in the Security Council. Your reaction and thoughts on that?
Chairman Smith, I'll begin with the impact on the elderly and the children regarding the situation. USAID is concentrated on the situation affecting the most vulnerable people in the country. Just to give you an example of how we're targeting children and elderly. In the case of children, USAID provides health and nutrition assistance to some of the most vulnerable in some of the most dangerous and vulnerable areas in the country. What that translates into, what that looks like is an example of a 8-month-old boy in the state of Jonglei late last year, got malaria, got terribly sick, got dehydrated, and became less than 8 to 10 pounds in weight. The mother carried that boy for 6 hours to get to the first accessible clinic. That was funded by USAID's partner, IMA Health International. That organization provides specialized therapeutic assistance to that child and nutrition support. That child gained back 3 pounds over the course of 5 weeks. And at that point in time, the mother was able to care for the child and to bring the child back home. This assistance, the health assistance and nutrition assistance that USAID and its partners bring to bear, sometimes in remote and dangerous areas, makes a significant difference. In terms of children and elderly, also making sure that our activities do no harm and our activities support the needs of such vulnerable populations. We have partners that have helped train communities that have been vulnerable to conflict and to displacement to be prepared when necessary to flee. And our partners have provided training for communities to have escape plans, evacuation routes, run bags, and in one recent case, that training was actually utilized just a day or so after it was received. And that training also looked at how to care for the elderly, how to make sure that we're caring for the needs of the children and the elderly as people flee.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me tackle the child soldiers question first. I don't think there is a really reliable number of the numbers that have been recruited, because a lot of children who have ended up in the conflict have been parts of militias and other groups such as the infamous New Era White Army, which is really a traditional hunting band which has been suborned at times in this conflict in support of the opposition. But clearly, when we look at a DDR program, one of the first actions, and where we would like to have U.S. participation in early intervention, is in identifying child soldiers and getting them separated and out and into some sort of psychosocial counseling so they can be reintegrated into society. Child soldiers...
For counseling?
The capacity in country does not. We would have to...
Is it even close? I mean, how quickly could that be stood up?
You'd have to bring in outside experts to work on this and find people in South Sudan who have some rudimentary skills and work with them to add to that. But this whole question of child soldiers is something that I engaged with the Minister of Defense on even before this conflict broke out. And I think we had a commitment from the government at that point, and they were working toward actually tackling this problem in a serious way. The conflict obviously set that back. The question about measures to take if the leaders don't cooperate. I mentioned in my oral remarks that really we have sort of everything on the table. We're prepared to look at sanctions. We're prepared to look at an arms embargo. I think one of the key elements, though, is what I discussed, which is we really want to make sure that that resources of the country are going to be utilized for the people of the country. And so we're taking a careful look at what has been stolen in the past and who stole it. So we are definitely going to pursue that.
If I could interrupt briefly, is Enough's project of help to you, the Century, their project to, are you working with them on that?
We certainly are working with them. They have shared information with us. We have been discussing this with them. I think it's a good information collection gathering effort, but we now need to take that forward in ways that the U.S. government is uniquely qualified to do, whether it's through our FinCEN at Treasury, which looks at this issue on a systemic basis, or through the Department of Justice, which would look at things in an individual case basis. And there's also executive order that gives us the ability to deny visas to people that are involved in corruption as well. So there are a number of tools out there.
So you have sufficient
can
authority
use.
for tools to hold individuals to account?
We have a broad range of tools that we can use should people be backsliding. The other big tool that we can use, frankly, is going to be getting those countries in the region who have no interest in having a failed state on their border to put their own pressures on. And often that is much more effective than what we can do from the U.S. This gets to the question about the unchecked greed and corruption. Again, we're trying to tackle that in two ways. One is looking at what's happened in the past, but more importantly, as I said in my remarks, we want to make sure that this government, there is transparency in its public finances. And we have already put the existing government as well as the opposition before they came together on notice that we would be looking for some sort of expenditure control mechanism to be in place. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to justify putting additional resources in support of stabilization of the macroeconomy. So that's a push we've been working with our international partners on. We've had a number of meetings, most recently last month here in Washington with key donors. And then on the events in the Security Council about the arms embargo last month. At that time, the focus of the efforts was to ensure that former Vice President Machar returned to Juba and the transitional government was stood up. And so the idea was not to punish for the fact that it wasn't stood up, but to encourage the parties to get it formed and to implement the peace agreement. And so we looked at what we could do that would have an impact that would incentivize both sides. And there the embargo actually came up short because it would incentivize the government much more, which could have led to greater resistance from the opposition. And so that was the problem that we were dealing with at the time. Now that they are one government, it should be easier to exert some of those types of pressures.
A deployment of 13,000 peacekeepers, is that about right? Is it enough?
The UN increased the peacekeeping ceiling to 12,500 troops in December of 2013, and then added another 500 to the ceiling in December of 2015. Those troops have not been found and recruited yet to deploy to the mission, and it took about 18 months to even do the first bump up. So there is a problem of finding people, troop contributing countries, and I think the role of the UN mission, protection of civilians, will begin to change with the transitional government. With a transitional government that's functioning, you should have people beginning to feel safe that they can now leave these UN camps, can begin to leave the IDP camps and go home. And that will also be the main thing, I think, that will alleviate the humanitarian crisis facing the country.
Thank you. Ranking Member Bass.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for conducting this hearing and also for our witnesses. While we welcome the return of Riek Machar to Juba, we recognize that for all parties concerned, including the United States, much hard work must be done to address effectively the current situation on the ground and help move this pivotal country and its people forward in peace. I had the opportunity to visit South Sudan twice over the last few years, and the opportunity to meet with the people and the leaders of the world's youngest country. During my first visit, a congressional delegation in May of 2012 almost a year after South Sudan's independence, there were high expectations of what independence could mean for the country, the region, and the diaspora. My last visit to South Sudan with my colleague, Mr. Capuano, was in November of last year. The difference between this visit and the first visit could not have been more stark. Last November, there was an atmosphere of fear and desperation. I saw and met victims of physical attacks and the internally displaced, all desperate for access to humanitarian assistance. I also heard about countless accounts of human rights abuses and about the degradation of women and their children in an environment where there appeared increasingly to be a lack of compassion. Against a backdrop of increasing intercommunal strife, perhaps the most telling statistics are those of South Sudanese seeking refuge in neighboring countries, including Sudan. Since December of 2013, the beginning of this crisis, the UN reports over 200,000 new South Sudanese arrived in Sudan. These refugees are in addition to the 200,000 South Sudanese who fled to Ethiopia, the ones who fled to Uganda, and the approximately 100,000 that fled to Kenya. In addition, South Sudan has an internally displaced population of approximately 1 million people. A major concern of all of us who monitor closely humanitarian issues is the blatant intimidation and killings of humanitarian workers, the majority of whom are South Sudanese. While we were there, I believe it was, Mr. Capuano, 2 weeks before we got there, there was a humanitarian mission where the boat was hijacked and everybody was held hostage for a couple of weeks, and everything on the boat was stolen. I'm also concerned about food consumption and the increasing crisis, the food insecurity, which both witnesses have referenced. But before I close, I want to note what I hope is a prospect for peace, and that's the South Sudanese Americans, the former lost boys and lost girls. We had a policy breakfast about this last week. There's a number of them that I'm sure are here in the room today, and if they are, they should raise their hands, that were former lost boys and lost girls, who came to our country years ago and have made incredible accomplishments, becoming doctors and nurses, and playing a very positive role in U.S. society. And so I'm considering introducing legislation that might have our government support some of them returning. And I wanted to know your opinions about that and how we might do that in a constructive way. Many of them in my conversations, and Mr. Capuano and I met with a group of, I think it was probably about 25 that came from all over the country. And they've accomplished a tremendous amount here. But, you know, they've left family back in South Sudan, and many of them have expressed an interest in returning. And I want to know your thoughts on that. The leadership vacuum that exists there now, and if you think they might be able to return and make some contribution. I also want to know, I mean, I realize that Vice President Machar just returned, but I want to know if you've heard any reports of anything that has happened. I guess he's just been there a few days, and I know he brought a tremendous number of forces with him. But what is the sentiment? What is happening now? So perhaps you could answer those couple of questions before I continue on.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. Let me answer the last part of it first about Riek Machar's return and the impact in Juba. I think one indicator is the strengthening of the South Sudanese pound today. So I think the markets are reacting favorably as one indication. The reception that he was given yesterday when he went directly from the airport upon arrival to the presidential grounds for the swearing in, and the speech that was made by President Kiir in particular was very, I think, uplifting. The president apologized not only to the people of South Sudan for the conflict, but he apologized to the international community for what has happened. And he raised the hands of both Riek Machar and Vice President Waniga, who is from Equatoria, so the three major regions of South Sudan together, and said, we are going to work together, and we are going to implement this agreement, and we're going to restore our country. So I think the atmospherics initially have been very good, and I commend the parties for that. There is still a lot of tough work ahead, and I anticipate that There are issues that were not fully resolved in the peace agreement, will continue to be contentious in going forward. But that's the real test. Can they show that they can work together? Can they compromise? And that's the challenge that's ahead of them and the challenge that we're putting to them.
Let me interrupt you for a second. You know, when we were there and we met with President Kiir, the whole idea of the new states that were created, he left us with the impression, and Mr. Capuano, I think you would agree, but he left us with the impression that that was not necessarily going to be implemented right away. Because how could these parties come together and agree to divide leadership and create a new government, and then in the meantime he goes and doubles the geographic areas? And I don't know how Machar is supposed to share power in that situation. Is it your impression, and we were there in November, is it your impression that he moved forward with the creation of these new states, or did he keep it to the number that it was before, which I think was at 12? 10. So he went from 10 to 28 states.
Unfortunately, Congresswoman, on Christmas Eve, the president did promulgate the order to create the 28 states. And despite strong pressure that they not move forward and actually implement that, they did move forward over the past couple of months, appointing governors and other officials. The events in Malakal at the POC camp, the underlying tensions for that were most likely a result of this 28-state decision, where the Shilluk community in particular felt they were being displaced because Malakal has been moved from a Shilluk-dominated area to a Dinka-dominated area. So the 28 states created not only difficulties in implementation of the agreement, which was based on power sharing of 10 states, but also created these additional ethnic tensions, which have played out not only in Malakal, but also in western Equatoria, western Bahr el Ghazal.
You know, practically speaking, what did they do? Roll up on the governor's mansion and tell the governor, or not mansion, but wherever the governor was, and tell the governor he's got to leave?
Well, in one case, in effect, yes, that did happen in Pibor, and there was fighting in Pibor town as a result of that, as one governor replaced another. We have pushed very hard, and with the support of the international partners and President Mohai, who's running the JMEC, the monitoring mechanism responsible for oversight of the implementation of the agreement, to push for the issue to be put off until the transitional government is formed, and for there to be a boundary commission that would look at what the borders of the states would be, and also, frankly, to take a look at, again, at the subdivision of the country. Frankly, South Sudan cannot afford 28 states at this point.
Did they redo the power sharing with Machar?
That is an issue that is still complicated because power sharing at the state level, as I said, was based on 10 states. The government has said any state that, new state that came from one of the states that the opposition would have gotten the majority in, the opposition would get the majority there. So instead of the opposition having a majority of the state government in 10 states, it would have the opposition majority in, I believe, 6 states. Or 3 states, 3 of the 10 versus 6 of the 28. That issue is one of those unresolved issues that's out there. I think this 28-state question will be something that preoccupies the transitional government in its early days, among other things. You also asked about security. Yes, there was provision in the security agreement that followed the peace agreement for Riek Machar to have security in Juba. They have now mainly deployed there, including elements of the Joint Integrated Police that will be responsible for security of the city.
So before I run out of time, though, if you wouldn't mind, the question I asked about the lost boys and girls who are men and women, and they're no longer lost. But what your thoughts are about that.
Clearly, there are a number of people, lost boys and girls, others from the diaspora, that have skills that would definitely benefit South Sudan. Some have gone back. You mentioned a leadership vacuum. I think the leaders there would argue that there's no leadership vacuum. There are plenty of potential leaders in the country. But I think I know what you were referring to.
Well, I wasn't necessarily referring to the president and vice president, but I mean, I think there's lots of layers, although that's debatable as well. You're right. A lot of new governors are needed, right?
But there, hopefully we won't need as many governors either. There are those types of programs. The World Bank has one known as Talk 10, which is the transfer of knowledge, which brings back diaspora members, helps fund them. So those are programs that have worked in some countries. There's always resistance, however, particularly when a country is coming out of conflict, to having people who have not been there come back and take over particularly more highly paid positions. But South Sudan clearly does need expertise. So whenever I meet with diaspora, I encourage them to indeed look for how they can contribute, whether going back or staying here and contributing from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yield to the distinguished chairman of the full committee, Chairman Royce.
Thank you very much, Chairman, for holding this. I know how involved you and Congresswoman Bass have been in this issue and in pushing for U.S. engagement on this issue, and we thank you for that. And I think yesterday, with the return of Riek Machar to Juba, we see maybe for once a real opportunity here. We thank the embassy for their work in that regard, getting in there. But I think establishing a transnational unity government is obviously the cornerstone of the step we have to take. One of my frustrations through all of this is that we have not utilized the arms embargo to shut down the weaponry that continues to escalate. And now that we've got a peace process, I think it begins to lay the foundation for the administration having argued, well, it's punitive to do that. I don't think it was punitive, but now it's conditional, right? It's condition, I would hope, Ambassador, it's a condition of the deal that we cut off the arms flow. And I think the problem is that with these factions so heavily armed now and spending their resources on those armaments, and with the deep distrust that they have, and I've spoken to both sides of this conflict, but they're now confined in the capital, and one miscommunication could spark an absolute explosion within the capital of not just the start of another conflict, but the loss of human life in that crossfire would really be catastrophic. So on that point, I think we've long used this argument of an embargo as an empty threat. We're going to hear, I see some of the witness testimony here that shows that witnesses are going to testify to the fact that in the past, actual imposition of an embargo have shut down the amount of violence. The threat of an embargo without imposing it, nope, that often actually increases the conflict as entities continue to ramp up. So I'm just back to something that I've, Ambassador Booth, long been haranguing about, but I just think it's really important now. Lastly, if they're going to respect the ceasefire, why would they still want to build up their arsenals? So I think from that standpoint, that's just one additional argument why part of this has got to be to prevent that cycle. It's been widely reported that this past February there was express support at the UN Security Council. What I saw was the UK, France, our friends among African Union members, all in support of that. So that's a good thing. And I don't know how bad things have to get to the point where the U.S. is on board, but I would suggest we're past that point. So, and not to belabor it. The last point I would make here are the financial coffers are nearly empty. They're not going to be able to repay any debts probably in Juba. So, Ambassador Booth, I'm pleased to read in your testimony that the administration is coordinating with other international donors to ensure financial commitments to support the transnational government will be conditioned on international oversight of both the revenue side of this and the expenditure side. I think it's vital. It's vital because, frankly, both sides have a long history with respect to, we'll just call it corruption or misuse of funds. And I would ask, what actions will the administration take if the South Sudan transitional government does not accept the prerequisite oversight mechanisms? I think that's wise to let them know that there will be consequences if they try to skirt that. Would we be ready to walk away from the table if they refuse that? And have we considered adding any new names to the U.S. or UN sanctions list? A lot of time has gone by. We haven't ramped that list up, and there's some pretty bad actors involved, and I think we've got to be mindful of that. We don't want to create a perception of immunity. So I'll allow you to respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. It's good to see you again. Let me address the issue about arms. We all agree that there are far too many arms in South Sudan, and that they certainly don't need any more. And particularly now that they're together in a transitional government, there is no point in continuing to build up the arms stockpiles. I think one of the ways that is most effective to get at this, and would be more effective even than an arms embargo if it was supported particularly by the region. And there are many in the Security Council who do not support it, and it was not even a unanimous support about a month ago when it was raised by the African members. So it's not an easy lift in the Security Council by any means. But the way to get at this problem really is through the public financial management approach that we're proposing. I mentioned also macroeconomic reform. And one of the things, in order to make this government budget anywhere near being financeable, they are going to have to make major concessions. And one that has been recommended to them by the IMF is that capital expenditures need to be cut basically to zero. Now, capital expenditures is weapons as well. And so if we can use the financial side of our approach to this to get at preventing additional weapons from getting into South Sudan, that would be I think, an easier way to do it and a more effective way to do it. I think also the Council support for this followed immediately after the events in the POC site in Malakal, and since then has diminished in ardor for doing this, and even more so given the fact that the transitional government is about to be formed with Riek Machar there. You asked what we would do if they don't accept sort of the transparency of the public finances. I think the answer there is they don't get the type of money that they would need to do things like stabilize the economy, to implement reconstruction, and really to move forward in any meaningful way on DDR. This country, because of the decline in the price of oil, and since oil had been their major, over 90% source of their revenue, the country is now really in a very difficult position. And so they really are going to need the help and support of the international financial institutions and donor partners. So we, I think, are in a good position to be able to achieve the type of intrusive role that we've been proposing.
Thank you, Ambassador. I see John Prendergast here. I just wanted to thank him for getting me into Sudan, even if it was without a visa. John, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. Pardon me, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you again to our witnesses. I want to just focus for a moment on the question of the child soldiers, and I'm wondering whether you, Ambassador, or Mr. Levitt, could talk a little bit about what we are doing to both prevent more child soldiers and to help secure the release of existing child soldiers. And to the Chairman's question, how large is the problem?
Well, Congressman, as I said, we don't have a totally accurate number because these are not formal military organizations. And many of the militia groups, I mentioned the Nuer White Army as an example, where they traditionally have brought younger children in as part of their cattle raiding activities. And when these cattle raiding activities become part of the conflict, yes, they become child soldiers. So the scope of the problem is something that needs to be defined as we go into this DDR program. As I said, it would be one of the top priorities would be to get the children away from other combatants. to get them into some sort of psychosocial counseling program, reintegrated back into their society, hopefully with their families.
But that's not happening at all right now.
That's not happening because there hasn't been a security sector reform program, so there hasn't been a start to DDR yet. But there has been a start of soldiers going to cantonment sites, which is a rather loose term because these are not sort of formal barracks, but more the villages where they would be then registered and accounted for. And so that's when we can start that process. But that's something that we would need to probably work with other partners to ensure there's sufficient funding to get that done. But the child soldiers is clearly one of the top priorities for DDR.
As a part of USAID's emergency education activities, 148,000 children have been enrolled, children and adolescents. That does not target former combatants, former child combatants, but there are former child soldiers who had served as combatants that are a part of those programs. And some of those former combatants have received psychosocial treatment.
Thank you. And with respect to the issue of the endemic corruption that seems to plague South Sudan since the very days of its formation, what can we do working with the regional governments to help the South Sudanese leverage their natural resources to make sure that the proceeds from those resources actually go to the people and not line the pockets of the political leadership? You know, what other steps can we take to help incentivize or advocate for that kind of approach? And secondly, would you just speak a little bit about what was the rationale for the creation of the additional states? Was it simply to give more appointments of governors, or was there some underlying policy? And how do you think that is likely to sort of unfold?
Well, on the issue of corruption and particularly how do you make sure that the resources that come to the state, basically the oil revenues, get used for the benefit of the state. That was something that we had identified during the peace negotiations, and we pressed hard for inclusion in the peace agreement of an intrusive public financial management oversight system. That was, I think, understandably resisted by some other countries in the region who are not particularly interested in setting precedents like that. But with the declining price of oil and the prolongation of the conflict, South Sudan is now in a position where it really has virtually no revenue. And so we are taking another run at this as a group of donors in conjunction with the international financial institutions to try to make sure that indeed what is owed to the state gets collected, goes to the Ministry of Finance, the central bank, and then is spent according to the budget so that there aren't a lot of extra budgetary expenditures. No one showing up at the central bank saying, where's my $200,000 that I asked for this morning? That has been a perennial problem in South Sudan and one that needs to be stopped. And the 28 states issue is interesting. During the peace negotiations, the opposition pushed very hard for a formal declaration that South Sudan would be a federal country, federal system of government, and the opposition pushed for 21 states in that federal system. The government at that time, Salva Kiir, supported by the mediation and by others such as ourselves, said the structure of a state is a fundamental issue that should be decided when you draft your permanent constitution. It shouldn't be something decided around a negotiating table over a peace agreement. That prevailed during the negotiations, and so it was rather shocking that President Kiir would float this then 3 months after having signed the peace agreement, something he had vigorously opposed during the negotiations. It was really done as a political ploy, I think, by both sides to particularly gain support from the Equatorias. The three Equatorian regions have long been supporters of a federal approach in South Sudan. And so there was a sort of a jockeying for political support that was going on. This unfortunately has created more ethnic tensions in parts of South Sudan and more violence. And so this has to be addressed by the transitional government as a priority matter.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Rooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the chairman of the full committee for letting me sit in today. I sit on the Appropriations Committee, the Subcommittee on State and Foreign Ops, which is why I'm here today and why I've taken an interest in your testimony. for obvious reasons, where our money is going and how it's being spent. And I appreciate your testimony and your job, and I also appreciate the sensitivity of diplomacy and how we must proceed forward despite certain setbacks. But I find it very interesting, some of the things that we've heard today, especially from the chairman. I know we talk about being disappointed and condemning violations of ceasefires, attacks on UN compounds, and the killing of civilians by government forces. I know recently Susan Rice went so far as to demand that the government of South Sudan investigate the attack it orchestrated against its own citizens itself, and bring itself to justice, as if it was the United States. If we, the United States, aren't publicly willing to hold those accountable for atrocities committed throughout the course of the war, and hold those accountable who raided the public finances to support the purchase of military equipment used to conduct systematic killings of civilians, it's kind of hard to fathom that this government is going to do that themselves. They're just not going to do it. It's not going to happen. So I think as an appropriator and somebody who votes to spend money on things that I think are important, I think that we need to send a message to let the people know that we're serious, that we're on the side of the people, and not the leaders, whether it be the government or opposition, and that we need to really tell, when we look at these leaders, that when we say and we demand a stand-down order, that that's what we demand, and not sort of, well, it's a touchy situation because governments are just forming, and we don't want to have sanctions or an arms embargo, because there shouldn't be arms coming in from either side. I mean, we've talked in our office to people that are in the NGO community. If there was a real arms embargo, it would have a real impact. The threat, or sort of like these half measures, I think actually, since, as I think the chairman Royce was saying, actually has a counterproductive consequence. So I guess my question is this: as an appropriator, somebody who votes to spend money, why are we allowing war criminals and war profiteers to dictate our policy while they deliberately lie, cheat, and steal from us? And how has the international community held those responsible accountable for this war crime? And what's to stop attacks like this from happening again? And what's it going to take to hit these guys where it hurts? I'm talking about the leaders on both sides, so that our people, our taxpayers in this country, feel confident that their tax dollars are not being wasted. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Congressman. You raised two issues: accountability for war crimes and also the accountability for the money that's been spent. On the issue of war crimes, gross violations of human rights, this is why the peace agreement includes the provision for the creation of this hybrid court for South Sudan, which would be created by the African Union, and they have begun to work on that. It will be hybrid. It will be with South Sudan, but the leadership of it will come from the African Union, and they have started work, and we're prepared to support that. Last May, Secretary Kerry pledged $5 million as an initial sort of down payment, if you will, to support this effort. We take accountability for gross violations of human rights seriously, and we will be in the forefront of pressing for that. We were the ones who pressed for the release of the African Union's Commission of Inquiry report. We have been very active in the UN Human Rights Council. We managed to get a resolution this past January that or February, that creates a panel of experts that will continue the work of looking at what has happened. My office, in conjunction with our Human Rights Bureau, is also funding a documentation center so that South Sudanese themselves can document what has happened, so that information is there for accountability purposes. In terms of the money, you mentioned that an effective arms embargo would have an impact. We fully agree. The problem has been, could you get an effective arms embargo? You need to have the cooperation of the immediate neighbors. And during the course of this conflict, there were divisions in the immediate neighbors. And those divisions played out in terms of support of arms and other equipment moving to both sides of this conflict. This is where, again, we worked very hard to help bring the immediate neighbors together in the Intergovernmental Organization on Development, EGAD, which ran the mediation, and President Obama's participation in a meeting with the heads of state of EGAD back in July, we think really was a major element in the breakthrough of getting them on the same page. And we had a month after that the signing of the peace agreement. So that's what's absolutely required, is to, if you want to have an effective arms embargo. But as I mentioned, I think we can get at this problem of spending money on arms when there needs to be money spent on food and medicine and roads through the very intrusive public financial management controls that we're proposing to the transitional government. And in terms of protecting American taxpayer money, that's exactly why we are proposing this. We want to make sure not just that we know how our money is being used, but how the money that is South Sudan's money is being used for the benefit of the people. And until South Sudan starts to put much more of its money, in fact, all of its meager resources at this point, to the benefit of its people and to reconstruction, that would be the trigger for us to then look at whether we can help or not. But we need to make sure that the practices of the past, whether it's corruption or misaligned spending priorities, need to be corrected.
Mr. Capuano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to appreciate the opportunity to be here, as well as not a member of the committee, but a longtime observer and supporter of the creation of South Sudan. Mr. Levitt, I want to start off by saying thank you. I can't tell you how much most of us love what the USAID does. You represent the best of America around the world in dangerous situations. As you said, 52, if I remember the last number, of your people have been killed, and never mind all those who have been harassed and threatened and with bodily harm, and actually received bodily harm that weren't killed. So I wanted to say thank you and appreciate that, and I would love to be able to do more to help them. I also want to be real clear, though, USAID doesn't operate in a vacuum. You operate with a lot of other partners around the world. And when we were in Sudan, we watched as people were given their rations for the month, and we were told unequivocally by the camp owners that the food they were given was calculated to last 20 days for the month. Not that the food would, but the nutritional value of that food was 20 days worth. So with all the work that we're doing, with all the money we're sending, we are still not providing people the absolute minimum to sustain themselves. And with that, Ambassador Booth, again, we've worked together for many years now, and you know how much I appreciate your effort and your work. And I actually, more than anything else, I appreciate your patience, which I don't have. You have to have it. I don't. But I do want to go back to the sanctions just a little bit. I want to be real clear that my support for sanctions is not just general sanctions on arms. There's so many small arms in that country, the sanctions not going to do anything to remove them. However, if the sanctions, in my opinion, were directly focused to the large arms that did not exist in that country more than a year or two ago, which cost millions of dollars for helicopters, millions of dollars for vehicles that can pursue people through swamps, it changed the face of that conflict dramatically. It's bad enough when bad actors are doing bad things, but then when they chase the unarmed civilian population out of a village, and then they can pursue them with a helicopter, and they can pursue them with vehicles that can get through swamps, that changes it dramatically. It's bad enough to be able to live in a swamp, live nearby in the forest. To be able to not even be able to do that is something that I would argue that if we focus directly on the heavier arms, especially now, the country, no one can argue that they need them now. And if we can't get sanctions through the UN, there are other ways that I will trust you are more capable of pursuing than I am. But again, for me, the focus is not that I wouldn't like to get rid of all arms, but on those heavy arms in particular. And as you know, we've had this discussion before. I would personally like to see chasing particularly the worst actors. I would love to see their personal funds chased. And I say that because they're not just sitting in a mattress in South Sudan. They're not in gold bars. They're sitting in banks in Kenya and Uganda for the most part. And it's cash that they have stolen from our money, from USAID, not just like cash, but items that they stole from you and then sold. And it's readily available. And again, I know we've had this discussion before and we have to go vote, but I wanted to add my voice to that, which you have heard before, but I wanted to do it here for the record as well.
Thank you very much. Let me just conclude with one final, very brief question and elaborate for the record, if you would. With regards to child survival, are children getting the vaccinations that they absolutely need to survive and to prosper? And the first 1,000 days of life, which I know Sudan has agreed to, is that a priority of USAID to ensure that nutrition and supplementation to reduce maternal mortality as well as child mortality being prioritized?
Our activities do our health activities and nutrition activities do very much focus on women and children at this time. With regards to vaccinations, I can take that for the record and provide you the details on that.
Because, you know, in the past, even when there were conflicts, and one of my first, I actually worked on this issue since I've been in Congress for 36 years, but I'll never forget when the FMLN and President Duarte, even in the height of their conflict in El Salvador, had days of tranquility in order to vaccinate the children. And tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of children were protected against polio, diphtheria, and a number of other child-killing diseases. And I just hope that's a priority. If you could get back to us on that, it's extremely important. We stand in recess. We have 4 votes, and then we'll reconvene for panel 2. Thank you so much.
So we have a recess right now. got all.
Oh, sorry. The hearing will resume. We do have some members en route, so I thought I would wait, but I think if we wait too long, we'll have another set of votes. So I do apologize for that set that intervened. I do want to, without objection, just put a brief statement in about this prayer petition for South Sudan. Deborah Fikes may have left, but she was with us earlier from the World Evangelical Alliance. 104,000 signatures on a resolution committing those people to prayer, asking our leaders to take bold action to ensure peace is realized in South Sudan by doing everything in their diplomatic power to stop the flow of weapons and ammunition that are fueling the violence and ensuring that those who stand in the way of peace are held accountable, to quote from the petition. So I thank her for providing the subcommittee with that. I would now like to introduce our distinguished panel, and I do hope the members make their way. There's no more votes for at least an hour and a half. Beginning first with Mr. John Prendergast, who is the human rights activist, best-selling author, and co-founder of the Enough Project, an initiative to end genocide and crimes against humanity. John has worked for the National Security Council under President Clinton, the State Department, and in congressional offices. He has also worked for the National Intelligence Council, UNICEF, Human Rights Watch, the International Crisis Group, and the U.S. Institute for Peace. He has helped fund schools in Darfurian refugee camps and helped launch the Satellite Sentinel Project with actor and activist George Clooney. Mr. Prendergast has worked for peace in Africa for more than a quarter of a century and has been a frequent and an expert witness that this subcommittee and other subcommittees do rely on for insight and counsel. So thank you, John, for being here. We'll then hear from Mr. Matt Wells, who works on Africa and peacekeeping at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, or CIVIC, with a particular focus on South Sudan. Mr. Wells has undertaken extensive field research on the recent conflict in South Sudan, examining issues including the targeting of civilians by armed actors, the protection of civilians by the UN peacekeeping mission, and civilian perspectives on the peace process and transitional justice. Prior to joining CIVIC, Matt was an Africa researcher at Human Rights Watch, where he led work in Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Liberia, Zambia, and he is widely quoted in a number of major news outlets who seek him out for his opinion and insight. We'll then hear from Dr. Luca Byung-Deng, who is a global fellow at Peace Research Institute, Oslo, and a fellow at Rift Valley Institute. He has taught at the University of Juba, South Sudan. He was a resident senior fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and visiting fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. He served as director of the Center for Peace and Development Studies at the University of Juba, a minister in the Office of the President of Southern Sudan, and a national minister of Cabinet Affairs of the Sudan until he resigned in May of 2011 after the government until that date. We'll then hear from Dr. Augustino Deng Meye, is that the correct pronunciation, Meye? Who is Director of Research at the SUD Institute. His major research interests include childhood mortality differentials in Sudan and South Sudan, applied quantitative methodology, applied development research, social accountability and public service delivery, and the demography of conflicts and violence. Prior to co-founding the SUD Institute, he worked in a wide range of research projects sponsored by the Office of the President of South Sudan, the World Bank, UNICEF, Integrity Research and Consultancy, Capacity Building Trust Fund, and the U.S. National Science Foundation. So welcome all four of you. Please proceed, Mr. Prendergast, as you would like.
Well, thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass, for your unwavering commitment to the people of Africa. On a personal note, and this is rather humbling, it's taken me now 30 years to finally identify the primary root cause of suffering in South Sudan and the surrounding region of East and Central Africa. The international community is spending upwards of $2 billion a year in South Sudan, but almost nothing is being done about the root cause. In South Sudan, the state has been transformed into a predatory criminal enterprise that serves only the interests of those at the top of the power pyramid. Competing factions of the ruling party have hijacked the state itself and are using its institutions, along with deadly force, to finance and fortify networks aimed at self-enrichment and maintaining power. Corruption and violence are not aberrations. They are the system itself. This is the definition of a violent kleptocracy. Unless it is addressed, we're just treating the symptoms, not the causes of these cyclical conflicts. Investigations that we've conducted with the Enough's Project's new initiative, The Century, have identified numerous cases of large-scale embezzlement through procurement fraud, outright looting of the country's natural resources, and countless examples of unexplained wealth. Funds are routinely and sometimes blatantly misappropriated and diverted away from South Sudan's central bank. In other cases, contracts are awarded to well-connected insiders. Money is transferred, but the services are never delivered. We're going to go public with some of these cases very soon. So addressing root causes, you need to involve the building of leverage, which until now has been cripplingly and puzzlingly insufficient part of international efforts to support peace and human rights in Africa. And I say it's a puzzle because when the United States wants to counter terrorism, or when we want to rein in nuclear ambitions, when we want to undermine drug traffickers, a basic element of the strategy to achieve these objectives is to build leverage through the use of financial statecraft tools. Biting enforcement of sanctions, anti-money laundering measures, prosecutions, asset seizure and forfeiture, and other economic tools of 21st century foreign policy are key instruments in securing U.S. foreign policy goals. How strange and disappointed it is that these tools are not utilized for promoting peace and human rights in South Africa and more broadly in South Sudan and more broadly in Africa. The surest way, in our view, to build leverage is by hitting the leaders of rival kleptocratic factions in South Sudan where it hurts the most and the place where they are most vulnerable, which is in their wallets. This requires a hard target transnational search of dirty money and corrupt deals made by government officials, by rebel leaders, by arms traffickers, complicit bankers, and mining and oil company representatives. Now, the bulk of my written testimony contains very specific recommendations for building that leverage to dismantle the violent kleptocracy in Juba. But given the time constraints, I'll just focus on a few. 2 for Congress, 2 for the administration, and 1 for countering an American war profiteer. First, Congress can do a lot to focus policymakers' attention in the Obama administration, but I'll highlight 2 specific recommendations. First is passing the Global Magnitsky Act. That is a catalytic piece of legislation, and we commend your original sponsorship of the bill, Mr. Chairman. We hope everyone on this subcommittee can be convinced over time to become a co-sponsor of that bill. Secondly, Congress can ensure that the government agencies that are responsible for administering and enforcing targeted sanctions and other tools of foreign policy, of economic statecraft, particularly the Office of Foreign Assets Control in Treasury, have sufficient resources and staff to create peace for real pressure for peace and human rights. Now, moving quickly to the administration, to the executive branch, they can do so much more to create the leverage necessary for the United States to be able to support and influence the peace process and undergird efforts at human rights that South Sudanese are making. I strongly welcome what Ambassador Booth said just a little while ago about corruption. Those are great words. We got to see action. First, I would say, first specific thing, and again, there are lots of specifics in the testimony, is that the proper use of targeted sanctions is really critical in all of this. We need to go after much higher level officials and then seriously enforce those sanctions, working to freeze and seize the ill-gotten assets that are identifiable. Secondly, some of the South Sudanese who are already sanctioned have continued, listen to this, these are guys already sanctioned, and they're continuing to openly travel and bank in international financial institutions. This is embarrassing. It completely undermines what we're trying to do and makes us into a paper tiger. The Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network should investigate these sanctions violations by banks and others and begin to discuss consequences with the sanctions-busting countries and banks. FinCEN, as it's known, should also send out a request to U.S. financial institutions inquiring about senior Sudanese officials suspected of grand corruption and money laundering. These actions could have a chilling impact on the facilitation of corrupt activities internationally. Finally, a word about a firm run by a U.S. citizen that feeds into this violent kleptocracy. Evidence obtained by our Sentry initiative appears to indicate that a subsidiary of Blackwater founder Eric Prince's new company, Frontier Services Group, has arranged to provide services to South Sudan's military despite repeated assertions by FSG that it is not involved in security contracts in South Sudan. Services that would require special authorization from the State Department that Prince's company has reportedly not obtained. Congress can work to hold these war profiteers to account by urging the State Department and the Justice Department to thoroughly examine whether Prince and Associates have violated United States laws and trade restrictions. Thank you for the opportunity and your commitments.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prendergast. Mr. Wells.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, members of the committee. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to testify today about South Sudan. I focus on South Sudan and peacekeeping for Center for Civilians in Conflict, which works to improve the protection for civilians caught in conflicts around the world. Over the last year, I've interviewed several hundred civilians affected by the conflict in South Sudan, as well as officials from the UN peacekeeping mission, the government of South Sudan, the opposition, and local civil society. I was most recently in South Sudan in March, investigating an attack on a UN peacekeeping base that housed 47,000 internally displaced persons. While there, I interviewed a man named Jameis, who first fled violence in January 2014 when the armed opposition captured his village. He went to Malakal town, where the conflict soon forced him to flee again, this time to the other side of the Nile. Last year, the double threat of food insecurity and attacks by SPLA helicopter gunships meant he was displaced once more, this time to the UN POC site in Malakal. He thought, not for the first time, that he'd found refuge from this conflict's relentless targeting of civilians. Yet on February 17th and 18th, intercommunal violence within the POC site deteriorated further when armed attackers, including SPLA soldiers, entered through a cut in the camp's fencing and proceeded to shoot and kill civilians and to burn down systematically parts of the camp. At least 30 people were killed, more than 120 wounded, many by gunshot, and about 1/3 of the camp was destroyed. This man's experience is unfortunately far from unique. I interviewed women who were subjected to sexual violence as their homes were set ablaze, who have survived by eating water lilies and after fleeing to the swamps, only to be pursued even there by armed groups, and who, after taking refuge in UN bases, have been subjected to sexual violence and other abuses merely while trying to collect firewood outside the camp. The much-delayed return of Vice President Machar represents a notable step in the peace process, but it's just that, a step, and one that does not in and of itself greatly change the risks of violence. The U.S. needs to ramp up its engagement on other key issues that will allow people the ability to begin rebuilding their lives without fear that armed groups will continue terrorizing them. In that vein, I'll speak quickly about 5 issues in particular. First, transitional justice. U.S. support is needed to ensure the implementation of all of the transitional justice mechanisms outlined under the peace agreement. Interviews that we and others have undertaken in South Sudan, civilians, regardless of political or ethnic affiliation, have widely expressed support for criminal accountability, locally driven reconciliation, and compensation. Criminal justice can begin to address the impunity that has made it acceptable to target civilians. Local reconciliation can bridge communal divisions that have been created or exacerbated by the conflict and by ethnic targeting. And compensation can help respond to communities' urgent needs, including rebuilding schools and clinics and returning stolen cattle, a key source of wealth in South Sudan, but also a potential driver of violence. Second, conflict over land. The U.S. should use its leverage to ensure that any decision about the issue of 28 states is made through an inclusive process that involves all of the country's ethnic groups, without favoritism based on loyalty during the conflict. The February violence in Malakal POC is linked to the 28-state decree issue, as is recent violence around Pibor and elsewhere. Third, an arms embargo, which I've been glad to hear much discussion about today. The U.S. should support an arms embargo through the UN Security Council. Even after the peace agreement signing, civilians continue to be targeted in many parts of the country, including in areas of the country where there previously was not conflict. There's little reason to believe that abuses will stop simply because the transitional government is formed. An arms embargo will help protect civilians from future attack and reduce unlawful attacks by both sides. As was mentioned, African countries on the Security Council, notably Senegal and Angola, publicly expressed support, as have the UK and France. Yet the US extended any decision about an arms embargo until June. The time for empty threats is over. The parties to the conflict have been given every chance to stop targeting civilians. Fourth, security sector reform. US support through both carrots and sticks is critical for meaningful reform of the SPLA and police. The splintering of the SPLA during the conflict has demonstrated that despite US investment, the military remains less a national institution than a collection of armed groups driven primarily by politico-ethnic concerns and loyalty to specific commanders. The US needs to learn lessons from its past engagement and ensure that the government and military take seriously SPLA professionalization that builds a national military that protects rather than targets civilians. Fifth, and finally, UN peacekeeping performance. The US has shown great leadership in working to support and improve UN peacekeeping. That should continue, as the UN mission in South Sudan will continue to have a critical role in protecting civilians from harm. There are more than 2 million people displaced today, including 186,000 in 6 UN bases. The mission has saved lives, but it's often been limited in projecting force outside these bases. And during the February violence in Malakal POC, UNMISS's response was simply inadequate, as we detail in a recent report. The UN has encouragingly set up a board of inquiry. We believe it's critical that the UN make public a version of that report and address any shortcomings identified. In addition, if the board finds that specific units failed to intervene and protect civilians, the UN Secretariat, with support of member states like the US, should ensure accountability. I'd like to again express my appreciation to the subcommittee for holding this hearing at a critical moment. The peace process has focused largely on bringing back President Kiir and Vice President Machar and the armies that fought for them. US leadership is critical to ensure the wider conflict dynamics are addressed, and that can't wait. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wells. Dr. Deng.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, and one is really honored for having this timely opportunity to make this hearing on South Sudan prospect for peace and security. But it's also at the time that you have a lot of pressure, but for you to keep South Sudan in the radar of your focus, I think this is highly appreciated. Maybe what I would like to share with you, what went wrong in South Sudan. Are there opportunities or challenges for ensuring peace and security? And third, what needs to be done to make sure that peace and security will be holding in South Sudan? I think I want to start first with this issue of what went wrong. I think given the fact that United States and international community, and indeed the people of South Sudan, they managed to have the independence, hard-won independence. It raised a lot of questions why South Sudan is slide to civil war. Because better understanding of this, the genesis of this crisis, is critical for us to look at issues of peace and stability. Many people have been putting a lot of myth about this conflict, sometimes being described as ethnic politics between Nuer and Dinka, and even sometimes is a power struggle within the SPLM, or even sometimes is being described as kleptocracy, as corrupt and then non-patrimonial system of governance. I think for me, this mystification of the bigger picture. South Sudan is a complex issue. It needs to be understood in a very comprehensive way. And I think because not getting it right, we did some work on these issues about looking at conflict from a different dimension. But I think it is very important also, when we are talking about Southern Sudan, to highlight some of the issues, the conditions that resulted in why South Sudan is sliding to. This is a country that had simultaneously 3 transitions: a transition from war to peace, a transition from liberation movement to government, and you know in most cases could result into a case of liberation, and then a transition from one united Sudan to an independent country. And they had this shock of loss of their leader, and also coupled with the fact that they rely on the oil, but which I think led them, and then coupled with the weak institutions, and given the fact also having a bad neighbor like Sudan. Because these are the things, any country subjected to this condition definitely should slide to war. Are there opportunities? Yes, indeed there are opportunities. One is this peace agreement. For me, this peace agreement, we made analysis in comparison to the CPA. It managed to address most of the root causes of the conflict. And it is very important, the fact that although the government raised some concern, the people of South Sudan, they see it as the only opportunity. And even the parliament unanimously endorsed this peace agreement. And for me, this is very important for us to focus on this peace agreement and there's some positive development happened, given the fact also the government took some measures, especially on issues of investigation about the atrocities. Another important opportunity is the SPLM reunification agreement. I think, it is very important for us. The crisis, the genesis of crisis started from the SPLM. We cannot have democracy without politics. We cannot have politics without political parties. And if you go and that's why we believe the reunification of SPLM, it is very important. I know Troika, US government are reluctant to support this reunification of the SPLM. And in a sense that will give SPLM the monopoly of power. I think it is very important to revisit your look at the SPLM. Then what are these challenges? I'm narrating some few of these challenges. This agreement, despite the good aspect, it is elite power sharing agreement. It is addressing the elites. It's not addressing the non-state security actors. So there's a very big gap between this agreement and the people on the ground there. I think let us be mindful about that one. Second, the issue of the status of the 28 states. The two parties have an irreconcilable position, but should not obstruct the peace agreement. Third, the security sector arrangement, a big hole. We need to refocus on it. And then this is a top priority. Third, the final status of IBA. IBA agreement was actually authored by the United States. And they have given the chance for the Bashir to dismantle, to obstruct the IBA Boundaries Commission, the arbitration, international arbitration. And actually people say the US abandoned the issue of IBA and has given even Bashir the chance to do. IBA will becoming a very thorn in the relationship between Sudan and South Sudan. Third, the unfinished of the CPA. We cannot talk about peace and security without talking about Nuba Mountain and Southern Blue Nile. Fourth, the role of Sudan. Sudan will continue to play a negative role in destabilizing. And in actual fact, because of its diplomatic relation now, it has beautified its image to the level that now people want to actually to relax the relationship with Sudan. Sudan is central, and it will continue to destabilize South Sudan. And I think even the issue of ICC to be out of the radar, human rights abuses have been committed now as we talk in Nuba Mountain and Southern Blue Nile, and even in Darfur. So we cannot talk about establishing Southern Sudan without focusing on issues of Sudan. Definitely establishing Sudan will be quite important. What can be done? First, I believe making the cost of non-implementation more than the cost of implementation. The parties should be made to believe that by not implementing this peace agreement, they will pay the price. And I want to appreciate the stand of the international community, the African Union. But indeed, even the threat of sanctions, actually, they are actually paying off. But let us make sure also the peace is beneficial to the people of South Sudan. Let us focus on agriculture. Second, sequencing peace and then justice and accountability. I think let us recognize the fact that the government of South Sudan conducted its own investigation about the atrocity committed in Juba. Let us use those ones as the basis for accountability and the hybrid court. But equally, let us encourage even the SPLM in opposition to conduct their own investigation about these atrocities. Let us make them to account for this one. Third, the non-state security actors, let us focus on them, especially the youth. And then the issue of the defense, and I agree with you, the defense and security sector reform, ABA. It is very important for the US government, because you are the author of the peace agreement, to renew your commitment so that the people of IBA actually, they voted overwhelmingly because they were not left with any option except to conduct their own referendum. And then the last one is community engagement. Let this peace agreement to be owned by the people, because these elites, they are actually interested in their own political gains. It is when this peace agreement is owned by the people, this is where we can be able to. And lastly, please, South Sudan is so viable. And it is very important, let us look at the bright side of it. You invested heavily, and I believe one day these people of South Sudan will rise up to realize their potential. It is an investment that's worthy. And thank you very much.
Dr. Deng, thank you very much for your testimony and for your insights. I'd like to now, Dr. Amaye.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Bass. I am delighted to be here and to be given the opportunity to present before you on the current affairs of South Sudan, my country. I just returned from there about a month ago. My contribution today focuses on the role of youth in engendering and sustaining peace and prosperity in South Sudan. This is particularly essential in the nation where well over 60% of the total population constitutes persons aged 30 years or younger. A nascent nation as known to many in the world, South Sudan is basically a country of youth who are rarely involved in its most important affairs, such as governance. Although a relatively large population of youth is good for development, as labor economists suggest, it could also be a source of tragedy, especially in the absence of strategic engagement of this group in productive economic activities. This situation is worsened by the fact that South Sudan's literacy rate is lower than 30%. This means that the human capital is really low, and that affects the country. Lack of educational opportunities, high unemployment rate, and political subjugation, as is the case in present-day South Sudan, make youth a liability for sustainable peace and development. As we know, it has been the South Sudanese youth who have actually been fighting on both sides of the just concluded civil war and prior wars of liberation. This seems to be a common experience in most contexts, developing contexts, and that is reflected highly in South Sudan. As South Sudan returns to normalcy, now that Dr. Riek has returned for peace to be implemented, how to turn this large population of youth into an opportunity will be tremendous a test. With properly targeted investment in this group, both locally and internationally, with the US government being involved, South Sudan could be on its way to prosperity, joining the rest of the productive democracies. When given opportunity, the youth make an incredible difference. A perfect example in our context concerns that of the lost boys and girls of Sudan who came to the United States 15 years ago. Displaced by a brutal civil war in the early 1990s and accompanied minors, this community that faced a hopeless future at the time lived in various refugee camps, both in South Sudan and the neighboring Eastern African nations before coming to the US, going to Canada and Australia. Prior to resettlement opportunities, thousands of older boys joined the war of liberation, with the majority being either killed or wounded in action. Between 2000 and 2004, the US government took the initiative to resettle over 4,000 lost boys and girls in the US. Being in a conducive environment and armed with adequate economic opportunities to better themselves, the lost boys and girls quickly made an indelible mark here in the US and back home. In a few years, this group acquired quality education from world-class institutions and gained remarkable work experience, including serving in the US Armed Forces. A generation committed to matters of stability back home, the group takes education as instrument for personal and societal fortification very seriously, with as many as 20 members of this group obtaining doctorates in medicine and philosophy, many of whom have now returned to South Sudan to support peace and development. Although confronted with challenges of South Sudan's political instability and personal economic opportunity responsibilities, the lost boys and girls, in their limited ways, are currently making important contributions back home through, for example, the Valentino Chagding Foundation, a young school, John Dow Foundation, School of Public Service at the University of Juba, the Student Institute, Merrill Academy, Nyahidin Foundation, and many other initiatives. Likewise, 4 of the lost boys that obtained their degrees between 2013 and 2015, and these are James Ali Garang, Gabriel Garang Ayer, Bjorn Quayer, and myself, returned to South Sudan to teach and provide services for the people of South Sudan, earning less than $500 a month. Benjamin Achek Machar, a colleague of mine, defended his dissertation a week ago. He's now on his way to South Sudan to support development there. With sustainable peace and increased support from the U.S. government and South Sudan and its other partners, the lost boys and girls can continue to significantly impact lives in South Sudan. As the agreement on the resolution of conflict in South Sudan gets implemented in the next few years, there will be need to support the government of South Sudan in skills development and strategic allocation of those skills across different sectors. With support from the U.S. government, the lost boys and girls who have already acquired both necessary academic skills and sufficient work experience in the U.S. could massively assist in this endeavor. In particular, the U.S. government should rejuvenate the skill transfer program instituted in 2006 that taps into the skilled lost boys and girls community to augment institutional and peace building programming in South Sudan. Gladly, a former U.S. representative, Frank Wolf of Virginia, was one of the first U.S. officials to recognize this necessity, introducing the Return of the Lost Boys and Girls of Sudan Act in the House in 2007. Revisiting this program is timely if the U.S. is to institute a speedy and sustainable impact in South Sudan. This initiative not only fosters institutional strength and stability for an incredibly distressed nation, it also paves ways for healthy leadership successions. It encourages the youth to have a voice in subnational and national policy dialogues, and amplifies young people's involvement in local development and peace programming. It places young people at the center of highly desired progress, subsequently creating a sense of responsibility and ownership of their future. What is more assuring is that many of the lost boys and girls are ready to return home in pursuit of peace and prosperity, but their return is not without economic hurdles, as many now have families to cater to and educational loans to repay. Therefore, a project similar to the Yes Youth Can in Kenya that was financed by the U.S. government could be replicated in South Sudan. In a nutshell, Mr. Chairman, as peace partner, the U.S. government may wish to consider an increased strategic investment in skills transfer program and the greater involvement of youth in institutional and nation-building initiatives in South Sudan. The U.S. government may also wish to extend more support to educational and policy institutions such as School of Public Service at the University of Juba, the Sud Institute, Center for Peace and Development Studies, and Ebony Center for Strategic Studies. With this few remarks, thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for your testimony, for your recommendations and suggestions, and for referencing an idea that was proffered by Congressman Frank Wolf, who is a good friend of mine and certainly a great friend of Africa. Let me just ask a couple of questions. First, before I do, I just want to recognize that David Abronowitz is here. David has been a long-time champion of human rights, trafficking, combating trafficking. He's the managing director of Humanity United, and I want to thank him for his lifelong commitment and for being here today and for, as he always does, offering very valid recommendations to all of us on how do we proceed on these important issues. He was chief counsel to the Democrat side of the Foreign Affairs Committee for about more than 10 years. So thank you, David, for being here. I'd like to ask a few questions and then yield to my good friend and colleague from California. Mr. Pendergrass, you talked about the one factor not being addressed. I raised it with both of the Ambassador Booth earlier today, as well as with Mr. Levitt, and that is this unchecked greed. And I think, and all of you might want to speak to this. You use multiple synonyms, each one with varying degrees of intensity, certainly looting frenzy, violent kleptocracy, looting and killing with impunity. And I think, human nature being what it is, we find in countries all around the world, very often at the core root, besides just an attraction to power, there's often this unbridled wealth that certain people are able to accumulate when they abuse power. If you could speak to how well or poorly the administration is doing. You made very specific recommendations, including FinCEN, the access to financial institutions in terms of money laundering and the like. You might want to elaborate on that. I asked Ambassador Booth earlier about your program, whether or not they were plugging in. How well or poorly has that occurred, in your opinion? Are they looking to you for recommendations, because it seems to me you take out the financial incentive, the ill-begotten gains from abuse financially, it certainly might lead to a better governance. Maybe not great governance, but a better governance. Secondly, Mr. Wells, you mentioned criminal justice, and you might want to elaborate how that might proceed, since so many acts of barbaric acts have occurred. There are so many victims. The case study you cited, which I repeated in part in my opening, I mean, she said, and I thought it was interesting, Rebecca, that she's not sure if she wants them prosecuted, but she wants to know who they are. And then you do go into the idea of a reconciliation process. Perhaps all of you might want to elaborate on what that might look like. Of course, the wounds are still fresh, so justice certainly is something that is on the minds of many people. So if you could on that. Dr. Deng, you made a very excellent point about the cost of non-implementation must be higher than implementation. If you might want to elaborate on what that cost entails. To whom? Are you talking about individuals, to the government itself? And you also made an excellent point about ensuring ownership of the peace agreement by the people themselves. How exactly does that occur? How do you bring the people who can either be the beneficiaries or, as they have been of recent date, the victims of bad governance and certainly this violence? How do you bring them into that equation? And all of you, if you might want to, because I asked the question earlier of Mr. Levitt, the whole issue of the health and the well-being of the Sudanese people. It seems to me that I was a little disturbed that Mr. Levitt couldn't say chapter and verse, this is what the vaccination program looks like. We are doing this despite the difficulties. There's a commitment here to vaccinate children against childhood killers, because we all remember the child survival revolution. One of the key pillars, one of them was oral rehydration therapy, and he did give an example of a young child who seems to have gotten that because of massive, huge dehydration issues. But vaccinations are one of the wonders of the world, and if we don't adequately pay attention to that, and again, with deep respect to Mr. Levitt, he will get back to us, I'm sure, that should have just rolled off his lips that this is what they're doing on childhood vaccinations. And in like manner, since Sudan is part of the scaling up program for the first 1,000 days, that is, to me, the most transformational program ever for reducing maternal mortality in those places where women got the nutrition and the food, as well as their unborn children and then their newly born children. Maternal mortality has dropped like a rock. So it needs to be prioritized, and I'm not sure now whether or not it is. Perhaps you have some insights on that as well. I have other questions, but I'll yield to Ms. Bass after those questions are fielded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think that the first point I would make is that kleptocracy, the idea that a system of government in our country, in many countries around the world, we expect government to secure the rule of law, to deliver social services, and all of the things that the people expect. In a number of countries around the world where corruption no longer is an aberration, but is actually the purpose and point of the system, unless there is a alteration of the calculations of those that are in power in some way, and it's hard to make those alterations and calculations purely from internal efforts. People work assiduously, like the two folks on the panel here from South Sudan to my left, who have, with many, many of their colleagues, worked for so long for human rights and peace and democracy and transparency in South Sudan. But they need help from the outside as well. And I think that accountability, basic accountability, is what so many, when all of us spend time in South Sudan, so many people are screaming for. Accountability for the commission of war crimes and accountability for the financial crimes that have left a country that is one of the most fabulously wealthy in natural resources completely and totally impoverished. As everything that wasn't nailed down has been externalized, offshored by the leaders of these two factions. in a variety of, whether in bank accounts or in opulent houses and all the other kinds of things that you do when you have that kind of money. So there are always, here's the problem, and I think that the Ambassador Booth sort of put his finger on it unwittingly. They always talk about the importance of reining in corruption. They always talk about the importance of accountability. But then when it's time to act, when it's time to vote for the arms embargo, when it's time to impose targeted biting and forced sanctions on higher level officials, when it's time to begin to investigate banks for money laundering for some of these institutions and individuals in South Sudan and their international collaborators, when it's time to do that, other competing priorities emerge. And people say, well, wait a minute, we don't want to upset the apple cart. REACT's about to come back to Juba. We got to do this, we got to do that. There's always something else that takes just a little higher priority than taking the action. Well, you do that long enough, and suddenly, or over time, the parties are like, they expect us not to do anything. They no longer take our threats seriously. We become the paper tiger that is written about so many times throughout history. And I think that's where we are right now in South Sudan, frankly, is we're the paper tiger, threatening to do this, threatening to do that, but never imposing. And then when we actually impose sanctions on a few mid-level officers, we don't enforce them. So they're traveling around the region, banking, doing whatever they want to do, with no consequence. Our inaction emboldens these folks to continue to commit atrocities on the ground. Violence is still occurring in a number of the states throughout South Sudan, irregardless of the machinations politically in Juba. People need to be held accountable for that. So the only way, in sum, the only way to reverse that dynamic is for us to start acting, to choose certain high-profile, important actions that we can take that can begin to introduce a sense of accountability, to begin to chip away at the impunity that these folks feel in Juba, that they can do anything they want to do, they can take anything they can want to take, and they can kill anyone who they want to kill with absolutely no consequence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On criminal justice and accountability, I think the positive thing is that the peace agreement in many ways gives us the foundation to address these issues through calling for the establishment of 3 mechanisms, in particular the hybrid court, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the Compensation and Reparation Authority. So the foundation is there. What's key now is starting progress to get these institutions set up and working. On the hybrid court, in criminal accountability in particular, there was a great study done by the South Sudan Law Society last year that showed that 93% of people that they interviewed in a large study favored criminal prosecutions for crimes that have been committed. There is an overwhelming desire amongst the South Sudanese to see criminal accountability. And the African Union has taken a notable and important leading role to that end. They will be in charge of helping set up the hybrid court. What's critical to see from the U.S. is support for that. Technical assistance, financial assistance, so that the hybrid court can begin to do its work. And right now, what we really need to see is the collection and preservation of evidence. Each day that goes by, we're losing the ability to access much of the evidence that's needed. So right now, it can't happen fast enough to get the process started to collecting and preserving evidence. On the reconciliation point, in interviews that we've done around the country, the key thing that people say is that this has to happen both at the national level and at the local level. It's not enough to set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that sits in Juba and focuses on the elite. We need a process that engages people around the country, that addresses not only the national conflict dynamics that my fellow panelists have talked about, but also many of the local factors that are driving inter and intra-communal violence. And the third thing is the Compensation and Reparation Authority that's often forgotten about. We talk a lot about criminal accountability, we talk a lot about reconciliation, but we don't talk about this issue of compensation and reparations. And for many people, getting some sort of immediate assistance, given the fact that their villages have been burned, their schools have been destroyed, their clinics have been destroyed, many of them have had their crops destroyed, their seeds for future harvest destroyed, and so there is an urgent need to allow people to begin rebuilding their lives. There's a lot of discussion around how best to set up this compensation and reparation authority, and I think it needs to ultimately follow two tracks. One, that longer term perhaps addresses individual reparations, but that more immediately focuses on collective issues, how to help villages begin to rebuild their lives, and how to address issues like the huge amount of cattle that have been stolen throughout the conflict and that will inevitably drive violence going forward.
Well, can I just ask you before going to Dr. Deng, on the hybrid court, did you just say that the U.S. is not providing money?
No, I'm saying they need to provide money. There has been, I think, a statement of $5 million. I think they expressed last year that they would provide for the court. Financial assistance is incredibly important. We also need to see from the U.S., given how many people here have experience with hybrid courts or international criminal justice, more generally, the provision of technical assistance to help work on things like, again, the collection and preservation of evidence, how to best protect judges and investigators and prosecutors that would be involved in this, how to set up a witness protection program, because ultimately people who come forward will face risks to do so. So how can we set up witness protection? I think the U.S. has a critical role to play in working with the AU on all of those issues.
Well, you know, there are people, and we've had David Crane testify several times before this committee. The Sierra Leone hybrid court or special court did magnificent things. And Charles Taylor is now serving 50 years, not in part, because of that court. If there's something more that we need to be doing, I mean, Ms. Bass and I were just talking, perhaps we need to do a letter or to be in touch again with the administration about making sure that money does flow, because you're right. As time goes on, witnesses are lost, information, memories fade, and then the fear of retaliation without the right kinds of checks, including for prosecutors and judges. You know, I'm not sure myself what the parameters are in terms of how many potential people would be prosecuted. You know, how high up do you go, and how low, I should say, on the people who have killed and maimed do you actually go? But we will follow up, and we'll do it in a totally bipartisan way, because we are on one accord, right? I think that's.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Deng.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for raising these issues. I think this issue of non-implementation to be more expensive than implementation. I think this is very critical. One, it is very important to focus on the implementation of peace agreement. This is the desire of the people of South Sudan. And the leaders have been entered into this agreement lukewarmly, but not fully, with their own calculation. And I think it is very important that we should make sure, for them to fail to implement this agreement, they have to pay the price. And the good thing that we have tools available already. First, I think the very fact that the African Union and IGAD, together with the international community, especially the United Nations, they have agreed to make this as this is the choice of international community, which is actually reflecting the will of the people of South Sudan. That by itself is a very important tool that we should capitalize on. Second, I think the parties, they know that they have committed crimes. And these crimes are documented. And it is very important to focus on this African Union Commission of Inquiry. It is a very important document that could be used to make them to believe that non-implementation, this is the consequence. So even with implementation. And third, you have this, the United Nations experts panel. They have been collecting a very good information about some of them, including the economic crimes. And as we talk now, the people of South Sudan, they know in details who did what. And these are the things that we should continue documenting them and to be available. We will talk about human rights abuses, but I think the issue of economic crimes, it may not be necessarily the Anti-Corruption Commission, but even we can focus on having a special court for these crimes. The other one, the very fact that the government of South Sudan collected some information in for the atrocities, which I think is a positive thing. But this information, investigation about the atrocity, they have not released this information. And this should be made public. In actual fact, the information we have, there is SPLA, they did their own investigation, the police did investigation, the Minister of Justice, and also the President himself. But these documents are not made available. And these are the homegrown initiative in order to achieve justice. Because those factors, I think, these are the things that these are the tools that we can use in order. But importantly, and I think this is something I did not mention, let us make also scenario analysis. What if the peace agreement fails? Because let us think out of the box. Because we should not be taken by surprise. The chances that this peace agreement may fail is quite high. Should we be reacting, or should we start planning as of now? Because such plans are very important. These scenarios are very important for the parties to know the consequence of non-implementation. The other side of it is making the peace agreement attractive. And this is where I believe that we should learn a lot of things. The government of South Sudan, for example, the embargo on what is called Comprehensive Agriculture Management Plan. This actually is I think, supported by JICA, and this is an area that we need to look. The whole lot is about, when you talk about the youth, especially the large population, is about the whole lot of agriculture, creating opportunities. And this is an area that we should make peace agreement attractive. We may need to invest also in the two leaders, Selfa and his vice president, how to work together. The way that enter into this relationship is going to be very fragile. And we need to invest in make sure that they are working for the good of the people of South Sudan. If you go for the zero-sum strategy, that you want to isolate each other, it is by the end of the day, the people of South Sudan will pay. So this is what I meant by the making non-implementation more expensive than let me come also the issue that you raised about the issue of community engagement. There is an organization called CEPO, Community Empowerment Program Organization. When I was in the Center for Peace and Development side, we started having what can we do in order to make the engagement of the people in this peace agreement. Leave alone letting them through civic education, let them access the information. But importantly, for them to know even their responsibilities. And actually, when we said the non-implementation to be more expensive, it is when the people themselves take it upon themselves and to let these people to be accountable. What do we mean? For example, one of the things that needs to be done for the monitoring of this peace agreement, let the public to know that this is what it means for them, and for them to follow who is not implementing. Because by the end of the day, these elites are relying on these people. But if these people are equipped, so this one of the programs is quite a comprehensive program of community empowerment program by this organization. That is actually I'm working with them, advising them also on this issue of on the transitional justice. I think I talked about this sequencing, and it is very important not to rush for accountability and justice if we don't have the good platform. The process should start slowly while we are creating environment for justice, and otherwise let us learn from the experience of Kenya. What should be done, let us make sure that these people, they commit themselves to peace. And this is going to be a good foundation for the issues of justice and accountability. But in the process also, we should start immediately documenting the information about the atrocity committed, especially what John said about the economic crimes. For me, these are the things. These are really, you can really get the people, get with those ones, and the other one actually come slowly. So let them. And then the most important thing is when you come for election. For me, election is a recipe for another crisis in South Sudan. Those resources really for election that we are invested, let us invest in making sure that laying the foundation for justice and accountability. So, but do it slowly in a way not to spoil the very fact that you need to focus on let me stop here.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Glad that you raised the question related to health. South Sudan, for some that might not be aware of its health statistics, has the highest mortality rate in the world. And we're talking of statistics that were collected at post-conflict time. Think of it now that the conflict has been going on for the last 2 years, and so many people affected across the board. I would think that the situation has worsened. Many people have died as a result of this conflict, adding to the prevailing conditions, poor health conditions. But I also want to bring you to the attention that even with peace, health conditions remain to be to not be changing much. I conducted a study. I'm a demographer in training, and I conducted a study that looked at the relationship between health and spending, the public spending. JP, I think you should know this. What we found was that there was no relationship in South Sudan. The more money you invest in health, basically did not make much of a difference. What this means is that the money that gets invested in health doesn't really get spent on health. It goes somewhere else. So that's the relationship between corruption there and health. What is it that's going on now? UNICEF, the UN, is still spearheading providing services in this area. UNICEF recently was campaigning for vaccination for children. They were claiming to be pursuing over 300,000 children, which is a big deal. And hopefully they are undergoing that. But again, this leads us back to this, that, okay, you have the UN, you have the US coming there temporarily, but how do you sustain all these activities down the road, 5 years, 10 years down the road? That brings us back to the idea of capacity, that the return to the lost boys and the lost girls is called for, that they should go back and be doctors and be the administrators in different capacities. Thank you.
Since you just finished on that note, Dr. Mayai, and it was very nice to meet you in South Sudan and then to see you here as well. You know, in the last panel, I raised the question about the lost men and women going back, and part of the reaction was, well, that could create some problems because the existing leadership would not take too kindly to that. But I'd like to know your opinion of that. I mean, you mentioned doctors, you mentioned administrators. It just seemed to me, but you know, obviously I was only there for a couple of days, it didn't seem like there was an abundance of folks on that level. So that's why it didn't seem to me like it would create more tension, but I'd like, you know, to know your thoughts on that. And then while you're thinking about that, Mr. Prendergast, you started talking about, which I want more information about, the company that you mentioned and their involvement on the negative side. And, you know, I mean, that's one of the benefits of our country, right? I mean, we can hold people accountable. And so I want more information about that. Now, I have your full testimony. I know what you gave was abbreviated. If it's here, you know, I will look at it. But I wanted you to talk more about that. You also talked about the wealth. And I guess that wealth is overseas because I don't know that it's there. I've always been leery about sanctions, and especially targeted sanctions, because to me it's just difficult to see how they have any muscle behind them. But then, you know, you talk about the wealth, so I guess the wealth is being hidden overseas. But, you know, sanctioning somebody to tell them that they can't come to the United States, it's hard for me to understand how that really, you know, has some punch behind it. So I would just like to ask those two questions right now, and then I know they're going to pull us away again for our last votes.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Bass. This is an important question, and it would have been great if Ambassador Booth was here while I respond to this question. Before I get into more details into this, I want to reference an effort made by Dr. Luca Byung in 2011 to return about 11 lost boys from here to provide support for an analysis that was conducted in the Office of the President. 11 of the lost boys, that went 8 remand. They were supported for a year by the Office of the President with Dr. Luca Byung advising the team, and 8 of the lost boys decided to stay. So that speaks to something. But let me say this. There is no question of challenges in terms of reception. But those questions are not related to what Ambassador Booth really raised earlier. And that is the question of resistance. The question of resistance should be looked at from this perspective. South Sudan does not have sufficient economic resources to hire highly qualified individuals, people with families abroad, people basically that have loans to pay. South Sudan just does not have that. Mm-hmm. But that does not translate into South Sudan not wanting these people to work in different arenas. I just made a reference to the 11 members of my group that went back. I would also like to make a reference to the group that was recruited in 2006 on the skills transfer program. Majority of these people did not come back. Some of them became ministers and GGs in the government. That also shows the commitment of the government to integrate these individuals. The problem is that the few that return and get integrated are not enough to exert that effort that is needed to change the system. So I think we should not be too pessimistic about the government actually trying to.
Well, how is that viewed from the other side? I mean, you know, if they're, that's great what you just said, but then are they viewed as taking sides? How does the other faction view?
The other faction as in which?
Well, which are? I mean, you know, the folks that split from the government.
Each political group has its own opinion.
I'm sorry?
Each political group has its own opinion. And I think.
So at this point in time, if people were to go back, when the government is being reformed, restructured,
right,
and both sides are there, would the folks that go back be viewed as taking Keir's side?
I don't see that because both sides have members here.
Okay.
And
Okay.
across
Okay.
the board here in Australia and Canada.
Okay.
And the recruitment should be fair enough to include all the qualified individuals to be able to go back and work. I don't think that would be a problem.
Okay, thank you. And I know that they have called votes now, so we have just a couple of more minutes.
Thanks. Okay, four very, very quick points. First, on the Frontier Services Group, we'll give you all the information we have.
Thank you.
So both of you can have that. Number two, the Sentry, which is this new initiative we've begun. George Clooney and I have hired a team of financial forensic investigators, and they are following the money all throughout East and Central Africa, but into the international system. Not trying to blame folks on the ground, because it takes two to tango in corruption.
Right.
So we're looking at the banks, the mining companies, the oil companies, arms dealers, logistics companies, anyone who is facilitating or profiting from human misery. That is the agenda.
I'm assuming this is our money too, right? This is our money, meaning U.S. taxpayers' money?
Oh, that's being
It
taken?
is-
Yeah.
yeah.
So there are lots of different ways that these guys make money. Most of it is through the looting of the natural resource wealth.
Oh,
So that's
okay.
the
That's
vast
different.
preponderance of the money that's
Yeah.
being stolen from East and Central Africa is gold, oil, diamonds,
Wow.
all the rest of it. But then they steal anything that isn't, like, so the aid money that comes in, contracting is a major thing, especially military contracting, you know, all that kind of stuff. So we have been sharing information with Treasury, Justice, and State and other governments that can potentially act. We will, in about 2 months, begin to come up here and start briefing you guys on the dossiers that we are building on a number of these networks, and then we'll go public later on in the year. Third, where did the wealth go? It's not millions, it's billions. I mean, the money just poured in. Remember before independence, there was a 6-year period when there was an interim administration. When that interim administration was stood up in 2006, the oil wealth sharing deal went into effect. So literally billions of dollars began to come into the coffers of a new administration that was administering the South Sudanese territory with no checks and balances. Of course, most of it disappeared. None of it went into services. None of it went into infrastructure. It's, as you said, somebody said in this thing, human nature. It's not surprising. It's happened all over the world. This is not a uniquely South Sudanese or African or any
Right.
other thing. This is normal. If you don't have the institutions and you don't have the oversight, it's going to happen. So slowly, steadily, and these guys have talked about the very, very important parts of this peace deal that create these oversight mechanisms that will begin to help. But in the meantime, and this goes to your point about why do you use targeted sanctions? Well, one has to assume that if there are no consequences for stealing millions, in fact billions of dollars, it's going to continue. So if you apply very specifically targeted sanctions on folks that have benefited dramatically from the ill-gotten gains, the money that was meant for
Like
the people.
freezing the money.
Freezing that money,
Okay,
seizing it.
that makes sense,
And
right.
returning it. That's the
Yeah.
ultimate objective.
Sure.
Return it to the people of South Sudan, at least some percentage of it. You
Right.
could fund the entire development budget of South Sudan for the next decade with some of the money that was still, some of it. So I think that's a really important, and that's fundamental to our theory of change. If you create those consequences for corruption, if you create those consequences for mass atrocities, you begin to affect the calculations of people. That's the beginning. And I think that's our role as outsiders, and we can support folks on the inside, Agostino and Luca and all of their allies and organizations that are on the front lines of working on these problems, at least the thing we could do is to make sure that when that money goes outside the country, we can grab it and say,
Right.
no, it's got to go back. It's not fair that people are living in houses with swimming pools all over the world, some small group of these people, and their kids are going to the best schools around the world, and there's a famine in the country from which
Right.
they came. That's just ultimately unacceptable.
Thank you, thank you.
I think we're out of time, but Dr. Dunn, please.
Wow.
How much time? You know, you do want to answer? Sure. I apologize deeply. Thank you for your insights, counsel. Any additional things you'd like to provide to us? Anything that prompted a, like further answer to that question posed by Ms. Bass? Thank you. The hearing's adjourned.
Over these. Thank you.
They're on my side. Let me sit there now.